I didn't pack my bags because I was angry. I packed them because I finally became invisible in the very home I had sacrificed everything to build. When my son pushed me against the wall, the physical pain was nothing compared to the sound of his silence afterward. There was no, "I'm sorry." No look of regret, just the cold, hard stare of a man I no longer recognized. My daughter-in-law, Olivia, was in the next room laughing and clinking champagne glasses with her friends preparing for their grand anniversary party. She heard the scuffle. She heard my breath catch in my throat, but she didn't come to check on me. To her, I was just a piece of old furniture that had finally started to get in the way of her perfect life. I stood in my small bedroom, the one that used to be a storage closet, and I realized that my presence in this house was a ghost story they were tired of hearing. I reached for the dusty suitcase under my bed, the one I hadn't opened since my husband passed away 10 years ago. As I folded my few sweaters, I could hear the upbeat music starting in the backyard. The smell of expensive catering drifted through the vents, mixing with the scent of my own tears. They were celebrating 10 years of a perfect marriage, while the woman who had paid for their first down payment was bleeding from a small cut on her arm and planning her escape. I didn't leave a note. I didn't cause a scene. I simply waited for the house to fill with the noise of 100 strangers so that my exit would be as silent as my life had become. As I walked toward the back door, suitcase in hand, I passed a large framed photo of the three of us in the hallway. We were all smiling a lie, frozen in time. I realized then that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't staying to fix what is broken, but having the courage to walk away before you are completely destroyed. But as I stepped out into the rainy night, I knew this wasn't just the end of a family. It was the beginning of a truth that was about to crash their party in a way they never expected. The cold rain hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of that house, and as the gate clicked shut behind me, I felt the first spark of a story that began long before that push, a story of how a mother's devotion slowly turned into a son's entitlement. To understand the weight of that suitcase in my hand, you have to understand the 30 years that led up to it. My name is Margaret, and for most of my life, I believed that a mother's love was a shield that could protect her child from any storm. When my husband Arthur died suddenly in a construction accident, our son Julian was only 7 years old. We were living in a small, cramped apartment in a gray part of the city, and suddenly, the world felt very cold. I promised Julian that day that he would never feel the absence of his father's support. I promised him that no matter what happened, I would be his foundation. I kept that promise at the cost of my own health and youth. I worked as a night shift nurse at the city hospital, often pulling double shifts just to afford the tuition for the private school Julian attended. I wanted him to walk among the children of lawyers and doctors, even if I arrived to pick him up in a uniform that smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. I remember coming home at 4 a.m., my feet swollen and my back aching, only to start packing his lunch and ironing his shirts. I didn't mind the pain because I saw it as an investment. Every ache in my body was a brick in the mansion of his future. Julian was a bright boy, but he was sensitive to the world around him. He saw the way the other kids had the newest gadgets and took vacations to Europe. I saw the shame in his eyes when he brought friends over to our small home, so I worked even harder. I sold the only piece of jewelry I owned, my grandmother's pearl necklace, just so he could go on a school trip to Washington, D.C. I told him I found the money in an old savings account. I learned early on that being a mother often meant lying to protect a child's pride. As Julian grew older, he became more successful and slowly more distant. He got a scholarship to a top university, and eventually he became a senior executive at a tech firm. I was so proud of him that I would tell anyone who would listen, from the grocery store clerk to my neighbors. When he met Olivia, I thought my job was finally done. Olivia was beautiful, wealthy, and came from a family that never knew the meaning of the word struggle. She looked at our life through a lens of pity disguised as kindness. When they decided to buy their first home, a sprawling estate in the hills of Willow Creek, they were short on the closing costs. Without a second thought, I sold the small house I had finally managed to buy for myself. I gave them every cent of the equity, $200,000, thinking that by helping them, I was securing my own place in their hearts. "You'll always have a room with us, Mom," Julian told me that day, squeezing my hand. "We're a team, remember?" I believed him because I wanted to. I believed him because the alternative, being alone in my old age, was too frightening to consider. But the room they gave me wasn't the beautiful guest suite with the balcony. It was a small, windowless space tucked behind the kitchen, originally meant for a live-in maid. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that being close to them was what mattered. I spent my days doing their laundry, cooking gourmet meals that Olivia liked, and keeping the house spotless. I was 68 years old, and I was working harder than I had when I was 30. But the more I did, the less they saw me. I became a background noise in their life, a servant who didn't require a salary. I watched as Julian changed under Olivia's influence. He started to speak with a sharp, impatient tone. He stopped asking me how my day was and started asking why the dinner wasn't on the table at exactly 7:00 p.m. I saw the way Olivia would look at my old, comfortable clothes, and then look at her designer handbags. She never said I was beneath her, but her silence said it every single day. I was the poor mother they kept in the shadows, someone to be used, but never celebrated. The transition from a mother to an inconvenience was a slow, quiet poison. I started to feel a heavy knot in my stomach every time I heard their car pull into the driveway. I began to realize that the team Julian spoke about only had 2 players, and I was just the equipment they used to play the game. I didn't know then that this foundation of sacrifice was actually a floor made of glass, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of their entitlement caused it to shatter completely. Even as I felt the cracks forming beneath my feet, I continued to pour my love into that house, hoping that if I just did a little more, the warmth would return. I didn't realize that you cannot fix a relationship with the same person who is actively breaking it. And so the days turned into months, and the small tensions began to grow into something much darker, leading us toward that final terrible night of the party. As the months passed, the small room behind the kitchen began to feel less like a home and more like a cage. The dynamic in the house shifted from helping out to total service. It started with Olivia's expectations. She began leaving lists on the kitchen island every morning, not requests, but commands. "Margaret, the dry cleaning needs to be picked up by noon." "Margaret, the silver for the dinner party needs polishing." "Margaret, make sure you stay in your room tonight. We have important guests coming over." I felt my heart sink lower with every list. I wasn't a mother anymore. I was an unpaid employee whose only benefit was a bed in a windowless room. I tried to talk to Julian about it one evening while Olivia was at a yoga class. I sat him down and tried to explain how I felt. "Julian, honey, I don't mind helping, but I feel like I'm invisible here. I miss our talks. I miss feeling like your mother." Julian didn't even look up from his phone. He just sighed, a sound of pure irritation. "Mom, don't be so sensitive. Olivia is under a lot of pressure and we're giving you a roof over your head. Is it really too much to ask for you to help around the house?" That phrase, "giving you a roof over your head," felt like a slap. I wanted to remind him that the roof was bought with the money from my house, the house I had worked 3 jobs to pay for. I wanted to tell him that every shingle on that roof was paid for by my sweat and my sacrifice. But the words got stuck in my throat. I saw the man standing in front of me in his $3,000 suit, and I didn't recognize him. He had become a stranger who spoke the language of debt and interest rather than love and gratitude. The tension reached a new height when Olivia decided to host a massive 10-year anniversary gala. She spent weeks obsessing over every detail: the flowers, the lighting, the guest list of high society names. I was expected to do all the prep work. I spent hours in the kitchen peeling vegetables, marinating meats, and cleaning the fine china until my fingers were raw and bleeding. When I asked if I could invite just one friend, my old neighbor, Mrs. Gable Olivia, laughed as if I had told a joke. "Oh, Margaret, this isn't a neighborhood potluck. This is a high-profile event. Mrs. Gable wouldn't fit in." I began to realize that I didn't fit in either. I was allowed to cook the food, but I wasn't allowed to eat it with them. I was allowed to clean the floors, but I wasn't allowed to walk on them when guests were present. One afternoon, I accidentally left a pair of my orthopedic shoes in the hallway. Olivia found them and threw them into my room, her face red with anger. "How many times do I have to tell you? Keep your things out of sight. This is a luxury home, not a nursing facility." Julian stood right there and said nothing. He watched his wife treat his mother like a nuisance, and he just turned away to pour himself a glass of scotch. That was the moment I felt the first real break in my soul. It wasn't just Olivia's cruelty, it was Julian's cowardice. I started to notice that they only spoke to me when they needed a task finished. If I sat in the living room to read a book, they would walk in and act as if I wasn't there, talking about their private plans and expensive vacations as if I were a piece of the wall. The week of the party, the pressure became unbearable. I was exhausted, my legs were swollen, and I had a nagging cough from the stress. I asked Julian if I could take a break and maybe go stay with a cousin for a few days. He exploded. "Are you serious, Mom? Right before the biggest night of our lives, we need you here to manage the caterers and keep the house running. You're being incredibly selfish." Selfish? The word rang in my ears like a bell. I had given him my life, my savings, and my dignity, and yet the moment I asked for a breath of air, I was the one who was selfish. The atmosphere in the house was like a ticking time bomb. The air was thick with unspoken resentment and the sharp scent of Olivia's perfume. I found myself crying in the middle of the night, muffling my sobs into my pillow so they wouldn't hear me and call me dramatic again. I was trapped in a prison I had paid for myself, waiting for a spark that would finally set everything on fire. I didn't know that the spark was coming sooner than I thought, and it would come from the hand of the person I loved most in the world. As the day of the gala arrived, the house was a whirlwind of activity. I was pushed to my limit, running errands and fixing mistakes made by the expensive staff Olivia had hired. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind was stuck on a loop, wondering how I had let my life come to this. I felt like a spectator in my own tragedy, watching the son I raised turn into a monster of entitlement. Little did I know, the rising tension of the last few months was about to reach a boiling point that would change everything forever. The day of the 10th anniversary gala arrived like a storm cloud. The house was a battlefield of ego and expensive decorations. Thousands of dollars worth of white roses were being delivered, and the kitchen was a chaotic mess of silver trays and high-end hors d'oeuvres. I had been on my feet since 5 in the morning, my knees throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. I was trying to stay out of the way, but every time I turned around, Olivia was there, snapping her fingers and pointing at a smudge on a window or a stray dust mote on a vase. The breaking point happened 2 hours before the first guest was set to arrive. I was carrying a heavy crate of crystal glassware, the fine crystal that had belonged to my own mother, which I had gifted to them. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, and my vision blurred for just a second. I tripped on the edge of the expensive Persian rug in the foyer, and the crate slipped. The sound of shattering glass filled the hall like 1,000 tiny screams. I stood there frozen, looking at the glittering shards of my family history scattered across the floor. Julian came charging out of the study, his face contorted with a rage I had never seen before. He wasn't worried if I was hurt. He was worried about the aesthetic. "What is wrong with you?" he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That was the centerpiece set. Do you have any idea how much work we put into this night?" I tried to apologize, my voice small and trembling. "Julian, I'm so sorry, I just got dizzy. I've been working so many hours." "I don't care about your excuses," he shouted, stepping closer into my personal space. "You're always playing the victim, always making everything about your sacrifice. You're an embarrassment, Mom. Look at you, you look like a mess. You're going to ruin the whole evening." I reached out to touch his arm to try and calm him down, but he didn't want comfort. He wanted a target. He shoved my hand away, and then, in a moment of pure, unchecked entitlement, he pushed me. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a hard, violent thrust. I flew backward, my shoulder hitting the sharp corner of a marble pedestal, before I landed hard on the cold floor. A searing pain shot through my arm, and I felt the warm trickle of blood from a cut where my skin hit the stone. The silence that followed was terrifying. Olivia stood at the top of the stairs looking down. She didn't gasp. She didn't run to help. She just crossed her arms and said, "Now look at the rug, Julian. There's blood on the rug. We have people coming in 90 minutes. I looked up at my son from the floor. For a split second, I saw a flash of horror in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, stony wall of pride. He didn't reach down to help me up. He didn't say my name. He just looked at me with disgust, as if I were a stain he couldn't wash out. "Just get out of here," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Go to your room and stay there. I don't want to see you for the rest of the night. You've done enough damage." I pulled myself up using the wall for support. My heart felt like it had been physically ripped from my chest. This was the boy I had protected. This was the man I had funded. I looked at the blood on my sleeve, then at the two strangers who shared my house, but not my soul. I didn't say a word. I walked past them, my head down, and went into my tiny, windowless room. I shut the door, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't cry for him. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who thought her love could save a man who didn't want to be saved. As I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, I could hear the party starting outside. I heard the upbeat music, the clinking of glasses, and the high-pitched laughter of Olivia's friends. They were celebrating a decade of success, while the woman who built that success sat in the dark with a bruised shoulder and a broken spirit. I realized then that Julian hadn't just pushed me against a wall. He had pushed me out of his life forever. And as the realization settled into my bones, a cold, sharp clarity took over. I knew what I had to do. I didn't pack a lot, just the things that actually belonged to me. My old photos, a few clothes, and the small wooden box that held Arthur's watch. I moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency. I was no longer Margaret the mother. I was a woman taking back her life. I waited until the music was at its loudest, until the toasts were being made to family and legacy. And then I picked up my suitcase. I walked out of that room through the service entrance and into the pouring rain, leaving the shattered crystal and the shattered lies behind me, headed toward a future that was finally truly mine. The night air was bitingly cold, but as I walked down the long winding driveway of the estate, I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the weight of Julian's expectations or Olivia's demands. I was only carrying a suitcase and my own dignity. I checked into a small, quiet motel on the edge of town, a place that smelled of lemon wax and old books. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room felt like a symphony. There were no lists, no shouting, and no shattered glass. Just me and the steady beating of a heart that was finally learning to beat for itself. The next morning, the perfect world I had left behind began to crumble, and I watched it from a distance like a spectator at a play. My phone was filled with frantic messages, not from Julian asking if I was okay, but from Olivia. "Where are you? The caterers left a mess. The house is a disaster, and we have a brunch at noon." I looked at the screen and felt nothing. No guilt, no urge to run back and fix it. I simply turned the phone off and went for a walk by the lake. I watched the ducks gliding across the water and realized that the world kept turning even when I wasn't there to hold it together. A few days later, I moved into a small, sunlit studio apartment in a different part of the city. It was tiny compared to the mansion, but every inch of it was mine. I filled it with plants and the things that made me happy. I started volunteering at the local library, helping children find books they loved. I regained the name Margaret instead of just being Mom or the help. I discovered that I liked my tea with a lot of honey and that I loved the sound of jazz in the afternoon, things I had forgotten during the years I spent catering to everyone else's tastes. Julian finally tracked me down a week later. He showed up at my door looking disheveled, the expensive suit replaced by a wrinkled shirt. He didn't come with flowers or an apology. He came with a problem. "Mom, Olivia's mother found out about the incident with the glass. She's telling people we're ungrateful. Our reputation is taking a hit. You need to come back and tell everyone it was just an accident, that you're fine." He looked at the bruise on my arm, which had turned a deep shade of purple, and he didn't even blink. He only saw a PR problem that needed solving. I stood in the doorway of my new life and looked at the stranger I had raised. "Julian," I said, my voice as calm as the morning mist. "The accident wasn't the glass breaking. The accident was me believing that my sacrifice could buy your respect. I am fine, but I am not coming back. I am not a character in your play anymore." He started to argue to tell me about the investment I had made in their house, but I stopped him. "That money was the price of my freedom. Consider it a gift. I've spent 30 years being your foundation, and all you did was build a prison on top of me. I'm done." As he walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I realized that I didn't hate him. I felt a quiet, profound sadness for him. He had everything, the money, the house, the status, but he had no idea how to love or be loved. He was a king in a castle of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. I went back inside, closed my door, and made myself a cup of tea. I realized that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back into your life. Sometimes it just means letting go of the anger so you can have enough room in your heart for yourself. The aftermath of that night wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow realization of peace. I began to heal, not just from the bruise on my arm, but from the bruises on my spirit. I found a community of people who saw me for who I was, not what I could do for them. I learned that my value wasn't tied to my usefulness, but to my very existence. The story of the poor mother was over, and the story of Margaret had finally begun. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's mansion. I was the queen of my own small, beautiful world. I often sit by my window now, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, and I think about that rainy night when I walked away. For a long time, I believed that a mother's heart had to be a martyr's heart. I thought that to be good, I had to be silent, and to be loving, I had to be invisible. But I've learned that the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the example of your own self-respect. If you allow yourself to be treated like a footstool, you aren't helping them. You are only teaching them how to walk over people. My life is much smaller now, but it is infinitely deeper. My apartment doesn't have a grand foyer or crystal chandeliers, but it has peace in every corner. I have a small garden on my balcony where I grow herbs and flowers. They don't demand perfection. They only ask for a little water and a lot of sunlight, and in return, they bloom without judgment. I realize now that I spent 30 years trying to be the sun for everyone else, and I forgot that I needed a little light for myself too. To those of you listening who are tired, who feel like your kindness is being taken for granted, I want to say this. It is never too late to pack your bags. You don't have to wait for a push or a broken plate to realize you deserve better. Your worth is not a currency that you spend to buy someone else's happiness. You are enough just as you are without doing a single chore or providing a single cent. Julian and I don't speak much these days. He sends a card on holidays and I send one back. The bridge between us is broken, and perhaps it needs to stay that way for a while. Sometimes, a bridge has to fall so that you can stop crossing over to a place where you aren't welcome. I pray for him every night, not that he becomes successful or rich, but that he one day understands the value of a human soul. And until that day comes, I will be here tending to my own garden. As I close my eyes tonight, I don't feel the phantom pain of my bruised shoulder or the sting of the words that were thrown at me. I only feel the softness of my own bed and the quiet strength of my own spirit. I walked out of a mansion and found a home. I lost a son, but I found a woman I had forgotten existed myself. And in the end, that is the most beautiful homecoming of all. Sleep well, and remember, you are the author of your own story. So make sure you give yourself the seat of honor.